Good afternoon and welcome to the panel discussion, Creating Access to HBCU Collections at Toward Radical Imagination. I'm Sandra Phoenix, Executive Director of the Historically Black Colleges and Universities Library Alliance, and I'm so pleased to be moderating today's session. Now, before I introduce each panelist, I'd like to remind attendees we'll be following the Digital Library Federation Code of Conduct, which we'll place in the chat. Audience members, if you have questions for the panelists, please use the Q&A function found at the bottom of your Zoom app. We will turn to questions and answers at the 40-minute mark of this 50-minute session. Feel free to type your questions at any time using the Q&A function on your Zoom toolbar. And now I will introduce the panel speakers by name, title, and organization. To view their full bios, please click the speakers page in the Zoom events lobby. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sharon Ferguson Freeman, Assistant Vice President for Institutional Research and Effectiveness at Mississippi Valley State University. Raeshawn McGuffie, Assistant Director of Technical Services at Hampton University's William R. and Norma B. Harvey Library and Authenticity Project alumni. Brandon Nightingale, Project Manager for the Black Press Archives Digitization Project at the Moreland Spingarn Research Center at Howard University. And now I'll start the panel discussion. Dr. Ferguson Freeman, you authored Creating Access to HBCU Library Alliance Archives, Needs, Capacity, and Technical Planning, a focus group study, which was part of a larger project and included the work of Dr. Sinatra Smith and Dr. Portia Hopkins. Could you share something surprising that came out of these focus group interviews?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for having me here today. So first of all of it was very exciting for me, for someone who doesn't get from behind my desk a whole lot, just based on the type of work that I do. But I was fascinated with everything that I learned. The sheer content and richness of the collections, I think, was most surprising to me. I learned a lot about what the libraries have in terms of African history, African American history, the civil rights movement. I heard a lot about that. I heard historical names being kind of tossed about, Paul Robeson, Langston Hughes, Dred Scott, Thurgood Marshall, all these folks either maybe attended these institutions or, were affiliated in some sort of way with the institution. So they have some things in their collections in that regard. In addition to some more contemporary folks like, Jerry Rice and NFL players. Of course, a lot of them attended HBCU, so you'll find things like that in their collections. Another thing that surprised me was it's kind of a ongoing theme that there was kind of a fear of maybe losing their collections sometimes, certain threats to them having their collections. And that included things sort of like just maybe not having the resources that they needed all the time to manage and maintain their collections. Of course, you have natural disasters that can happen, floods. You had Katrina that impacted one particular institution, or probably more than one institution down in Louisiana. So those fears are kind of there in terms of their ability to be able to maintain their collections. So probably the last thing that surprised me the most was this, I guess this common thing that's happening now where PWIs, or predominantly white institutions, are kind of coming along and maybe buying up collections or co-opting them in some sort of way. So just that was surprising to me. So just the richness of the collections and the fear of not being able to perhaps hold on to them and maintain them in the way that they would like to.
Thank you, Dr. Freeman. Brandon, You manage the Black Press Archives digitization project. Could you share a bit more about this work? What do you do in your role?
Yeah, so for one, thank you for having me, and this is an amazing panel full of some great panelists, and the entire program I think is amazing. But specifically for me, the Moreland Spingarn Research Center's newspaper collection, the Black Press Archives, it represents over 2,000 newspaper titles from the U.S., Africa, and the African diaspora. It is one of the most valuable research features, eagerly sought by visiting scholars and graduate students. It has a little over 3,000 microfilm reels of newspapers, totaling well over 100,000 individual issues of newspapers. The collection includes complete files of Black papers, as well as the records of Black editors, publishers, and journalists. And again, papers from all over the world, really. You look at African-American papers, we have African, Caribbean, Afro-European, Canada, South America. And so the overall goal of this project is to digitally preserve the rich history of the global Black experience for research and access to the collection for years to come. And so in 2021, Moreland received a little over $2 million from the Jonathan Logan Family Foundation to digitize the entire collection and make the collection accessible to the public. And so I was brought on in May of last year, 2022, to lead this project or manage this project, excuse me. And so the project, it'll be conducted over approximately 5 years in 3 specific phases. One will be selection, arrangement, and description of the unprocessed papers. 2, the scanning, and then 3, the digital curation and preservation. And the final product will be available for research in the Moreland Spingarn Research reading room, with select materials made available online through the center's digital Howard institutional repository. And so a lot of the day-to-day operations for me so far have just been laying the foundation for the project, right? This is sort of my first full year in this role. Coming up in May, it'll be officially a year. And so I've been, I've hired a student staff so far. We've done a lot of good things so far, laying the foundation, putting together the standard operating procedures, right? The actual project itself, or when the grant was written, when the proposal was written, excuse me, it was written under, or that the project be carried under the federal digitization guidelines, basically the standard for us to digitize this work. And so just implementing those federal guidelines is a process, right? So we've been doing all of that, getting the equipment, right? Some state-of-the-art equipment into Moreland. All that stuff takes time. So we're really just laying the foundation for the project right now, and also preparing for the future, which is to host and make available the collection to the public, online for everyone across the world to access the collection.
Thank you, Brandon. Raeshawn, you provide access to special collections through metadata creation and discovery platforms in your role as Assistant Director of Technical Services. Can you share why metadata creation is an important aspect of creating access?
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. There's construction going on outside of my window, so please forgive any extra background noise. Well, metadata is information about information, right? So I generally explain to patrons and students that the metadata is like the digital version of an information card that you see next to a piece of artwork on display. So you need to know as much about the item as possible, right? So that includes where that information came from, who created it, how to use it, how to access it in some cases, if necessary. You also need to know if the information is linked so that you may get back to it or reference it somewhere else. You all, of course, would need to know what type of format the information is in. Is this the original format, or has it been converted? It's also most important to have searchable keywords for the item. It's amazing to me how many people will walk up and say, I need to know or I need to be able to search for a thesis, or I need to search for something about a print. Well, which prints? We would need to know. My automatic reaction, of course, is, do you mean Prince Rogers Nelson or Prince Henry? And people don't realize, oh, the search term would have to include Prince Harry's real name, which is Prince Henry. So those are the types of things that you need to know, which is considered metadata. And you have certain fields that you would have to lay out or put in place so that you have the uniform verbiage used across other formats.
Thank you, Raeshawn. The next questions can be answered by any panelist. What sorts of opportunities do you think there are for HBCUs, grant makers, and organizations who can partner authentically to create access to HBCU collections?
Okay, I'll go first. Well, I know that there are a lot of opportunities with different funding agencies. However, I know that those same funding agencies, especially the larger ones, still say that they don't get a lot of applicants from HBCUs, and perhaps they're not aware that on the campus side for the HBCU, you a lot of times have to convince the administration that the information or the project is necessary. And I don't believe that a lot of those funding agencies are aware that so many of the HBCUs have indirect costs that are put into place that is so high that it might not be worth it to apply for the grant, especially if those funding agencies do not, or the campus does not allow for matching funds. So that makes it difficult to want to actually go through the process if they're saying, well, we need you to be able to match 10 or 15%. And you know for a fact that the policy on campus is no matching funds whatsoever.
Yeah, so Sandra, I think they funding agencies, grant makers would need to be kind of intentional about their purpose for offering funding and understand, you know, the challenges that the libraries tend to face. What I found out from the focus groups is that usually when it comes to archives and special collections, you may not even have a person in that position. That person may be someone who has another primary role, who's working with archives and special collections in addition to their primary role. So not only that, usually in higher education, everything's tied to the academic programs themselves. And if your collections and your archives are not tied to those programs, or tied to accreditation, or tied to those performance measures like retention and graduation rates and those sorts of things, it's hard to get on the radar of administrators and others. So they have a challenge when it comes to their archives and special collections. They have the challenge of getting just that foundational support. You know, from what I heard them say, you know, a lot of times they just won't have those kind of basic things that they will need. And they're always kind of scrapping and fighting for, you know, funding for those, you know, those basic needs, because the way I understood it, it seems like the archives and special collections are kind of maybe secondary to the academic programs when it comes to level of support. So in terms of grant makers, they would have to understand it would take a substantial amount of funding, because a lot of times you would have to get in there and take care of that from the bottom, you know, from the bottom up. And it will be a long-term commitment. You know, it's not something that you can just give a few dollars to maybe for a few years. I think it would take a long-term commitment. And it would involve things like training, not just the equipment that will be involved, you know, scanners and whatever equipment and software, but you're talking about training people, keeping them trained, you know, paying perhaps even some of their salaries, because the funding on the campus is just that much competition for funding that it would take quite a bit. So they would have to be intentional and kind of know that that's what would be required, is that you're trying to overcome this deficit when it comes to working with archives and special collections.
Yes, and to piggyback off of what Sharon was saying, I think that's, right on the money as far as what are the intentions, right, for both the institution or whoever's holding the collection and the potential funders, because it could be two sides that aren't on the same page, as far as what the long-term needs are for the university, and more specifically the collection itself or collections, and the people that are giving the money, right? I know for me specifically, we're working, very closely with the Jonathan Logan Family Foundation, and they have, specific things that they want done with our collection, and we're on the same page there. Now, I wasn't in on the initial proposal and getting that done, but that's a process in itself, right? Just coming to the table and agreeing to it. But there are tons of opportunities out there. In my time prior to Howard, I was at Bethune-Cookman University, and it was a challenge, right, to go out and get funding, especially when there's no cost sharing available, right, from the university. I think that definitely was a challenge during my time at Bethune-Cookman, because a lot of the things that we were looking at was specifically for matching funds, and so it has to be right for both parties, but specifically institutions, these HBCUs that house these collections. And the last thing I'll say is, who knows about your collection? I think that's so important as far as who are you talking to, as far as potential partners to come in and put money into these collections. Who's doing that discussions, or who's leading those discussions? Because a lot of times what you find is people that actually work in the archives are not a part of those discussions. And so that's probably the most important piece, is you have to actually go see what it is that the people that actually work in these places, what are their needs, as opposed to talking to some of the outside folks. I see that happen quite a bit in my time.
And, one more thing, grant writing, that's a skill. It requires a certain skill set. And from what I heard from the library deans and directors, they don't always have that skill set in-house. So that could be something else that a grant maker should take into consideration, hey, what about the application process, or what about the assistance with the grant making process that would help institutions as well?
Thank you. Next question. What makes HBCU collections unique?
Well, I don't want to dominate the conversation, but, having spoken to, about a third of the HBCU libraries, deans and directors, from what I learned, you've got a part of American history that's being captured and contained in these collections that probably don't exist anywhere else in the world. So that's what makes it, them unique. You've got, like I named some of those historical figures, some contemporary figures who attended the HBCUs and or who passed through those institutions in some shape, form, or fashion. And then a lot of times, sometimes HBCUs, we may be the only ones who are capturing the things that are happening in our communities. So I think that's what makes our collections unique. They're going to contain the histories of the institutions for the most part. Most of them, of course, are going to have a collection specifically about their institutions, where they're tracking information, they're keeping the papers from the presidents and, all the events that they have, and the research, they're trying to keep up with the research that the faculty, their faculty are participating in, and their students and so forth. So those types of things make HBCUs collections unique.
I agree. Not only that, speaking from someone who has attended HBCUs as well, my experience at Fisk, my experience in North Carolina Central University, any work that I did that I left there is specific to that campus. So student newsletters and everything, they're also kept in some of the special collections and everything. So when students come back and want to look at their work, not just the information that's about the administrators and faculty members, but you have someone who will come back during homecoming and graduation who want to see an article that they've written and everything. So, and students want to come back and find an old document that they created years ago and want to expound on it when they decide to go back to school 20 years later. So the collections speak to our unique experiences on the campus, and they also speak to our experiences in the community around that university. So you have so much to contend with and appreciate about them that a lot of people don't realize that so much of those collections are deemed not valuable or would not be considered valuable to PWIs until someone on the PWI campus needed to do research, or until someone suddenly became important in society and the PWI institutions wanted to gather the information for their numbers or to do some sort of display. And the fact that, oh, it's only located on Hampton University's campus, so we would have to go there to obtain it and go there to dig for information is what makes the collections unique. We're the only ones that have it.
Yes, and to piggyback off what everyone's already saying, yeah, the biggest point for me is that community aspect, right? They tell the story of the community. I think I didn't really understand that. For me, my first sort of role in an archive was at Bethune-Cookman University. I was there the last 3 years, and it wasn't until I moved there and I realized how much information I found about Daytona Beach, being at Bethune-Cookman University, right there at Bethune-Cookman, just by going in the archives and looking through some of those collections. They told the stories of the community leaders, not just the school leaders and institutional history, but it was that community. And often people came into our researching rooms specifically looking for the history of the community. And so I think that's probably the biggest thing I would say about as far as the collections being so unique and so valuable. And the last thing I'll say is, oftentimes, I'm sure we all know, these HBCU collections are, for the most part, unprocessed, right? You can look all across the board, a lot of them are unprocessed. So just that alone, right? A lot of people don't even know what exactly it is, all that they have. And so once you start digging through and start finding out, oh, wow, this is here and that's here, you start to revive that history that is within those collections. So I think, it's an unfortunate issue, right? Lack of resources, lack of funding, lack of things. But once you actually get inside and start digging through and start processing a lot of these collections, that's when you see, I think, the value of it right there, right? And that uniqueness, once you actually get through some of those collections and start processing everything.
Thank you. Next question. Part of what we're talking about throughout this virtual conference is authentic partnerships. In Dr. Ferguson Freeman's report, those she spoke with relayed a clear frustration about PWIs acquiring historical collections from libraries and from the African American community. In what ways can organizations like PWIs partner authentically to support creating access to HBCU collections?
So for me, just listening to what the deans and directors were saying, I think they could partner authentically by listening to the HBCU, understanding their needs, perhaps going into an agreement, understanding that if there's going to be an agreement at all, that that agreement may need to be revisited regularly, and perhaps clarified sometimes, and perhaps changed, in case the relationship veers in a direction in which the HBCU no longer sees itself as perhaps owner of the information in the collection. For me, I think an authentic relationship would keep those collections at the HBCU. I mean, certainly a partner could help to make those collections accessible to the public, but I think ownership should remain there, and that communication be kept open, and that those partners kind of be mindful of what's happening in the African American community and what's meaningful to the institution and what's meaningful to that particular community. Just keeping all of that in mind when forming a partnership between PWIs and HBCUs when it comes to collections.
I agree. The first thing that came to mind was, why are the PWIs acquiring the information from the libraries? Like, is it because they want information to be accessible to everyone and the HBCU has not made those steps? Or is it simply because they want the collection to add to their numbers? I fully believe that partnership would be valuable. I believe that there is a way to go about it, but we need to know, for instance, is it because someone who is employed at a PWI but was affiliated with an HBCU just wants to see the collection on display, wants to take care of it, wants to nurture it and everything, and they just so happen to be at a PWI and the partnership could take place? And how would we be able to make sure that we could maintain ownership of our items and documents? That is something that really takes a lot. You have to get legal involved in everything. And how would the planning, time management come about? Who's accountable? All those questions come to mind. So I actually agree with Dr. Freeman that a lot of these things need to be set in stone and be adjustable when starting something like that.
Yeah, and I would say, yeah, for me, it's the foundation of, said agreement, if that's something that the HBCU does with the PWI, because oftentimes I think, from what I've seen personally, it's been a quick sort of scenario where the PWI comes in and helps, and then they sort of get that information and it's on their repositories, on their sites. But then the HBCU was sort of left with very little supervision. And then the collection or whatever it is that's being digitized, for an example, is not maintained at the HBCU. So then the only place that you can actually access that is the PWI. And so the foundation has to be solid as far as when the HBCU comes to the table with the PWI, if longevity is not at the center or at the forefront of these agreements, meaning the collection is sustainable at that at the HBCU, a real question has to be asked of why even do it if it's not going to sustain that longevity at the HBCU, not at the PWI, because oftentimes it's the PWI who has the longevity for that collection on their sites when it should be the opposite. And so I think coming to that initial agreement, why are we doing this? Number one, of course, that has to be the main reason, but sustainability, right? And sustainability at the HBCU. It cannot just be one-sided for the PWI.
Thank you for those responses. Next question. How, if at all, has COVID-19 changed creating access to collections? Has it changed thinking around access, collection development, workflows, methods, budgets?
I'll go ahead. I know for us, again, I'm going back to during my time with Bethune-Cookman, a lot of the pivots that we had to make during the pandemic actually helped us out. I know for us, as soon as everything sort of, went virtual and things like that, we, had to cut off all access to in-person coming in and viewing the letters of Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune and other institutional papers. And so we had to quickly sort of pivot to an online way of sharing access, right? One of the campaigns that we started, and that is still going on today, was sharing some of the letters of Mayor McLeod at Bethune-Cookman University weekly, right? That was something that had not even been thought of prior to the pandemic, right? But when you're forced to cut off access to those letters, we then were able to, put a campaign behind it. And then, all that goes out to the students and the staff, and it starts raising awareness. We're starting to have conversations about some things that Mayor McLeod Bethune was doing in the past. And it was so much that came out of that pivot as far as getting access to the collections. And then again, people start to see these things, right? When you get it on your social media, when you send it out through email, text, and then conversations begin to happen about, oh, wow, this letter here, well, how many more letters do you have? And more information. And then you start having conversations about bringing in money to help digitize and manage these collections. And so there were a lot of good things that happened. I know, during the pandemic, for Bethune-Cookman when I was in the archives, specifically because we had no choice but to go virtual. When you take away access to in-person, visitations.
Honestly, I think in the beginning of the pandemic, yes, we stopped all in-person patronage and everything. And then we moved slowly towards only people who were faculty and staff members were allowed to check out items. We had to stop a few overzealous staff members from drenching items in Lysol, but I didn't see a lot of change other than having to halt our ILL participation because we were already in the process of moving away from digital participation or platform with our Viva Consortium to paying for the Content DM platform ourselves and everything. So we were already in that process when the pandemic hit. We were, I guess, blessed because we were here every day. I think we only did remote like maybe 2 weeks and we were still coming to work and everything. So I honestly can't say that there was a lot of change in the library on campus. Otherwise, that's when a lot of digital things were implemented, a lot more equipment and everything were brought in that way.
So the focus groups that I conducted actually happened about a year into the pandemic. So everybody was kind of still in the thick of things. There were some institutions who had not even gone back to opening their doors quite yet. And so what the librarians were telling me was that it kind of pushed the issue of digitization to the forefront, the need for digitization to the forefront. Because what would happen is, during this time, this was, you had the George Floyd tragedy that happened, and, there was kind of like an awareness of racial issues. People finally started to become interested in African Americans and, our history and HBCUs and so forth. So they were getting a lot more requests for the type of information that was in their archives and special collections. And so what happened is they kind of saw that, look, this process is very labor intensive for those who had not gone to digitization. They had to go in and go into those boxes, they would say, and, and find things or what have you, and then come up with a way to kind of try to electronically share that information. I understood that sometimes they would get on Zoom to share an art piece or something like that. So they did a lot, they made a lot of adjustments during that time, but it did bring to the forefront, from what I gathered, a need for digitization because they already knew that they needed it. And, they knew that it was a need. It's just that kind of brought it more to the forefront. So for me, I think that's probably the most important thing, I guess, that came out of COVID is that, even though digitization, they knew that they needed it, I don't know that it would change a whole lot for a lot of them. And it's going to be interesting to see, because I have not spoken to any of them since, we've gotten past COVID and we've gone back to our campuses. It's interesting to see. It would be interesting to see, if they kept any of those processes in place, or if anybody took this to push their digitization efforts forward, did it have, did they get any more money? Did they change their processes, to reflect what they were doing during the pandemic? So digitization, I think, was probably a key focus that came out of COVID.
Thank you for your responses. And we're at the 40-minute mark, and we're going to turn this over to Aaliyah now for the Q&A.
Hello, everybody. My name is Aaliyah Raeshawn. I'm a Clear Events staff person, and I'm just going to be reading the questions that have been coming in through the Q&A, and we'll get to as many as we can. So I'll start with the first one. How do you know your collections are unique? Is there a way to digitally access your collection and confirm the uniqueness?
Well, for us, we frequently do searches about the topics. When we plan on our next items that are being digitized or next collection that's being digitized, we actually go out and search, and that's how we determine which items will be digitized, because we have an anti-slavery pamphlet collection. However, if that pamphlet is already online somewhere, especially on a free platform, we're not going to put that one up. We would put the one that's unique and has not been made open access or available to everyone. There's that, because we also have to contend with, we're paying for a platform, so we need to be discerning about which items will take up that space on the platform, because you are only paying for a certain amount of gigabytes or terabytes to store.
I think for me specifically with the Black Press Archives at Moreland, it's a couple ways I kind of gauge that. Number one, since we sort of officially launched, meaning on social media and let people know that we got a staff, and the amount of requests that have come in since then it's just been amazing. And we're not even really fully taking on requests. Our goal is to digitize the papers and make them accessible. The requests and things that'll come sort of later down the road with the library division at Moreland. But specifically, when you look and break down the requests, that's enough data for us to sort of understand what people are looking for, right? And what makes our collections so specific. I know one of the main things when you're talking about the Black press and you talk about whether it's foreign or here in the US, majority of people that have contacted us so far, they're interested in lynching, right? And so that's going to be valuable information for us when we build our website, right? To make this collection accessible to the world. We may, because of all these requests, we may end up having a specific section for our papers, that deal with lynching, or other things that we're getting requests on. So I would say that's one thing. And the other thing is, as people come into our space, right? We're at Howard University, historic Howard University in Founders Library. So the amount of people that come into our space and they see some of our collections and they go, and ooh, and oh wow, y'all have this and y'all have that. That lets us know right there, how valuable our collections are, just by, a lot of the reactions that we get once people see just a little bit of our collections. We're starting to digitize everything.
So from what I heard the deans and directors say, their collections are unique to their institutions because they're about the institution's histories, and they're about people who've passed through the institutions usually. So that makes those collections unique to those institutions. And there'll be collections of things that have perhaps been donated by families or organizations specifically, directly to the institution. So in those ways, I can't speak to that because I'm not a librarian by profession, so I don't know any of this for sure, anything for sure, but I would say in those ways that those collections are probably specific to the institution in some sort of way. And that's what makes them unique.
Great, thanks for those responses. We'll move on to the next question. Social media accounts have discovered HBCU's uniqueness and are mining HBCU libraries' digital collections to post and share the history and legacy. How do we teach and encourage ethical and legal usage of our materials without discouraging people. I know we want and need the spotlight and shine, but I'm seeing inaccurate information being proliferated. How do we correct the record? And I'll go ahead and put that in the chat as well so everyone can see that.
Well, I can start that. I know for us specifically, again, we're dealing with the Black Press Archives, newspapers, Black newspapers, across the world. One of the things that is going to be a challenge, I already know, because we haven't really had these discussions yet, but once we digitize everything, then what, right? Part of that then what is getting the permission from the publishers to get that stuff online. I think those conversations that we have to have with each publisher, that's going to determine a lot of what we actually make accessible to the public, because you got to think some of these publishers no longer exist, and we have copies of their papers. A lot of these papers are foreign, and so how do we make those connections? And then as far as right here in the U.S., we have, I will say, we're working hand in hand with the National Newspapers Publishers Association, who actually, it's a joint collection. They donated that collection to Howard University, and we still have communication to this day. So I think it's first for us getting those permissions from those publishers, making sure that everything is done the right way first before publishing, and then coming up with a system, which again has not been put in place yet, but to make sure that everybody has access, and right, what platform we use and what website, and everything behind the scenes, all that stuff is going to be very, very important. As we begin to make our collection accessible to the public. We may tease a couple things here on our social media, but we want to be clear. We want everybody to get back to the website, right? That's on Howard University's website. That we want that to be the main place that you can access our papers.
That's true. I agree with Brandon. One of the things that we do here is we determine per collection. We have a private URL. Like if you look at our website right now, you don't see our digital collection that's here on Hampton's website. We have a private URL that we would send out when people make requests, because we haven't completed what we like to say is our security measures. And that is determining which items we want to have a watermark, because we do use Content DM. I saw that someone had asked what platforms. We do use Content DM, and they allow for you to only put 1 or 2 pages of a book or something up, and then we can say, if you would like to see the full document, please contact us, or please visit the Peabody Special Collection, and put the information about the collection up so that they can see it and make an appointment to come and view it, depending on what the collection is. If it's our yearbooks, those will probably be fully on display digitally, simply because we own them, and so many people come in every year for homecoming to ask to see a photo of their grandmother from 1927. So it really depends on the collection for us as to what will be available fully. Yeah.
I think it's time for us to end the session, and I want to thank the panelists and the attendees for their participation. Please check your schedules for what's next. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.